Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. As most of you know, I spent a considerable amount of time in prison, and prison reform is something that I take very seriously. Now, obviously, my experiences have been limited to a men's prison, but today's guest is here to talk to us about what it's like being in a women's prison. Now, if I'm correct, the principles involved would dictate that the women's prison is very similar to the men's prison. But again, today's guest is going to tell us about her experiences. Now, she wasn't just a prisoner. She is the former award-winning blogger for Prison Diaries. She is a writer for the Witness LA and the Connecticut Examiner, and she is also a columnist at the National Memo. And by the way, although she did spend 6 years in women's prison, she still maintains her innocence. Chandra Bozelco, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Michael. It's good to be here.
So, to get started, what was a standard day like in women's prison?
I would say it's probably the same as a standard day in a men's prison, although I don't have that exact comparison. For me, ever since 2009, I was in prison from 2007 to 2014. So from 2009 on, I worked in some type of a kitchen, either the production kitchen or the distribution kitchen, which is basically the chow hall. And so I would get up at 3:30 in the morning, go to work at 4 after count cleared, and then work until about noon, sometimes later, in the kitchen. And then I would spend the rest of my day writing things that I was trying to get published while I was inside. So I think we have the same schedule in terms of like rec time and everything else as men in Connecticut's prisons. But I think it's substantially similar. So it's I was in, because you were in Connecticut as well. The women's prison in Connecticut is the only women's prison for state people on, held on state charges. So
Yes.
we have both pretrial and sentenced women together in that one facility, which means that we have people that are both charged with, breach of peace, the lowest criminal charge in the state, and also convicted of capital murder, and we're going to be sentenced to death, but the jury came back with life sentences. So we have two extremes residing in the same facility, sometimes in the same cell. So I think in that respect, the women's prison in Connecticut is a little bit different than other places because we have these extremes residing together or working together or doing anything together. So I think that was one of the unique parts of my experience, is that I got to see both low-level offenders, people who really didn't do much of anything but couldn't afford a bond, be stuck in York Correctional institution, and then also see people who are going to spend literally the rest of their lives there and never go home because they were sentenced to life without parole. So I think that in Connecticut, at least, the women's prison there's a kind of a weighty feeling to your day, because you know that there are many people who will never see home again, and then there are also people who should have been home 3 hours ago, but because they're poor, they can't
get out.
Yeah.
So how much out of cell, or I don't know, are they dorms or cells at York? Both. Okay. So how much rec time do you get both indoors and outdoors a day?
We actually got very little outdoor rec time in the half that I lived in. There's York Correctional has two halves. It's called the maximum side and the minimum side. The minimum side actually doesn't even have a fence around it. It's just kind of assumed that people are so either far along in their sentence, or their sentence is so short, and they're such low level. They've been classified as such low level risks that they can be trusted to live in these kind of dorm facilities on the east side of the facility. On the west side, that's where I spent most of my time. That's cells, 2-man cells or 2-person cells, that, 2 women would reside in them. And there were about 24 women on a tier, 4 tiers in a building type of thing. So out of cell time was 8:30 to 10 in the morning, then 1:30 to 1 to 2:30 in the afternoon, and then 6:30 to 9 at night. So not a lot.
Okay. And how do the women spend their time out at rec? What types of activities are they engaged in?
Not a lot. Watching TV. If they don't have a TV in their cell, they would watch the common area TV. They would play cards. They would draw, read, write. A lot of them had jobs throughout the facility, working in the laundry, working in the kitchen with me. There were other, the industries, we called it. That's where they actually made the clothing. It's the Connecticut's correctional departments. They have their own LLC, a private
Yeah,
company.
Correctional Enterprises of Connecticut.
Yes. They have the women sewing uniforms and doing things like that in one area. Then they also, we pack everyone's commissary in the women's prison, and we also have what I mentioned before, the production kitchen, whereas we make most of the meals that are then shipped out to the men's prisons. They're actually cooked and created at York, and then they get shipped out to the various other prisons throughout the state.
Yes,
So a lot of women have jobs.
A lot of the guys complained that you would have bitter ex-girlfriends and ex-wives making food for the men.
I'm sure we did. I wasn't one of them, but I'm sure we did.
So you did a lot of writing while you were incarcerated. Now, in the men's prison, I like to do a lot of reading, a lot of writing myself. And what made it excessively difficult was the level of noise. When inmates were out for tier rec or even in their cells shouting out of their doors and whatnot, it would just be mind-numbingly loud. I'm just wondering, is the women's prison, is there a similar dynamic? Did that interfere with your ability to do all the writing you did?
Yeah, I would say that I'm going to guess. I haven't been in every prison, but I'm going to say that most prisons are loud. I think, first of all, it's the security matter, right? So our tiers were like kind of sealed off. One whole wall was glass, so that the COs could watch us and observe us while we were doing whatever, and then everything else was cinder block. So you're in this kind of container, right, where the sound is going to reverberate no matter what. So I think that no matter, even if it was a relatively quiet place, I think it's going to seem louder than it really is. And then there were a number of women there, and I'll probably catch a lot of flack for saying this, that who were I would say unreasonably loud. Like, rather than talking in a normal tone, they had to yell, or they would yell down a hallway rather than going down a hallway to say something to someone. So there was that. And then just in general, there's clanking of doors. There's just the noises you wouldn't have in a normal living situation. Keys, you know the sound of keys. I know the sound of keys, like almost like a dog knows the scent of a bone, and I react to them. So there are all these different noises, and yes, it was very hard, but I also just got a radio and headphones and just blocked it out like that. But yes, I would say in general, prisons are pretty loud. It's hard to think. And then it's also, I've written about this, really hard to sleep, right? Because you have people, even at night, you have people opening doors and checking on you, sometimes shining a flashlight right into your eyes as you sleep, just to see if they could wake you up, to be nasty, that kind of thing. So it's really hard to sustain any activity that requires a steadiness, I guess I'll say. Like, so for sleeping or for reading or for writing, it's really hard. I would say that the typical prison day is pretty chaotic. If it's not just noise, then it's interruptions and emergencies, or disruptions to your day, that kind of thing. So it's really hard to do anything in a sustained way. I would say that was true of me the whole 6+ years I was there.
One of the things that I've tried to focus on when I talk about prisons is, in order for a criminal to rehabilitate, the criminal needs to alter fundamentally his or her character structure. This requires a deep change in thinking, which requires a lot of reading, a lot of introspecting, journaling. All those things are made very difficult in such a chaotic environment. And it's not just the rec. You can have a cellmate who doesn't care that you're reading and doesn't care that you're trying to better yourself, and will listen to the TV loud or the radio loud, or be yelling out the door. One of the most apt descriptions I've ever heard of prison was given by Susan McDougal. When Martha Stewart was on her way to prison, somebody asked Susan McDougal if she had anything that she would say to Martha Stewart. And she said, "What I would say is that she is going to a place where the people thrive on chaos."
Yep.
And I thought that was just so perfect. And the thing is, that type of noise is supposed to be against the rules. It's supposed to be against the rules to be watching your television without your headphones, or yelling out of your door, or slamming dominoes, things of that nature. But that's one of the rules that's simply not enforced. So, and that obviously falls on the correctional officers. So what effect do you think the culture of correctional officers has on criminal rehabilitation?
Well, I think some of them thrive on chaos themselves, right?
Yes, they
So,
do.
so there were, as well as I do, that there are some that are just really great people, right? Like I had my kitchen supervisors, were terrific and actually protected me. Then there are others who really like to see, um, dissent amongst the inmate population. They like to see people fighting. They like to see girlfriends getting into drama over imagined, slights in their romantic relationship. They like all of that and they encourage it. So I think that that's a certain element that they, if they can, the bad ones, if they can contribute to the chaos, they will, right? And they know exactly how to do it, and they have the ability and the authority to do it, and then also escape, right? Right as things get kind of hairy. So I thought I saw that a lot. And then a lot of times they, if you were to say, I mean, I didn't really ever complain about other people because I just knew that I was pretty unusual in there with my background. So I knew it was probably not wise for me to say, can you get this person to turn our TV down or anything like that. Um,
Yeah.
so I didn't say that, but if someone else did, used to say, I used to witness people say, like, some of the COs say, well, why do you care if her TV's loud? And
Yeah.
obviously the person cares because she wants to sleep, read, just be peaceful
Sure.
for a minute. It's obvious why she's asking for that. And they would kind of start like, why are you starting trouble, when she was really just trying to correct things and get things to way that they, like you said, are supposed to be, in the facility. So the COs, then there are other ones, as good ones, who would say, like, this TV is too loud, you need to turn it down, you have to have concern for your cellmate and make sure that she doesn't, she can sleep or she can do what she needs to do, that kind of thing. So they could contribute to it, they could also stop it. The good ones I found really did try to stop it, but not in a cruel way, just recommend, like, you need to be more thoughtful and more mindful of the people around you, which actually, when you think about it, that's what crime is that you're just not mindful of other people's rights or the fact that there are rules or something, right? It's a lack of mindfulness and a lack of thoughtfulness. So I used to, like, kind of have a mini hope that when they would say these things, like, be mindful of the people around you or thoughtful to your cellmate, that this was an attempt at rehabilitation. But I didn't always see it take the way that it should, right? It didn't take root,
No.
the way that we would want it to.
So you said something that caught my attention a few minutes ago. You said you said there were COs that were great people. Would you say that because there's a distinction here that I make. I had a debate once with a correctional officer on his podcast, or a former correctional officer, former correctional brass. And I made the statement that I've never met a good correctional officer. And he flipped out about that. And I told, the distinction is, I've met correctional officers that I thought were nice guys or nice women who were good people. But as correctional officers, as people that are supposed to be following the rules, they have an administrative directive to go by. I've never met one that did. And the example I gave him was a correctional officer's duty bound by their directive, by the oath they take when they take that job, to report the unethical behavior of coworkers. They're not going to do that. And that's just one thing. And then the amount of, or the lack rather, of rule enforcement in prison. And a CO often is regarded as good when he just lets inmates, basically do what they want. He doesn't write anybody up. But that's not a good CO qua good CO. What I mean is that it's not a good CO in according with what his job's supposed to be. So when you say that that your kitchen supervisor was a great person, does that person do his job or her job? And have you come across correctional officers that did their job the way that they're supposed to do it? And I mean consistently, not in a haphazard way.
Yeah, I mean, my correctional supervisors, I just want to be clear, they were kind of isolated from the rest of the nonsense. They only had to deal with kitchen workers. So I would say, even under your definition of a good officer, they were, right.
Okay.
They would let us know when we did wrong. They didn't necessarily always write us up, but they would stop it, right? So they weren't really invested in punishing us, but
Yes.
in arresting the bad behavior, they were.
Yeah.
And in terms of turning other people in, they actually did. Like, they actually
Really?
did turn the other one in, and it wasn't even in a bad, was just like, this is happening and this is unworkable. So we need to fix this. So I actually think that those, now we're talking about maybe a group of maybe total of maybe 15 men and women.
Yeah.
So this is an exceedingly small representation of
Yeah.
The
And
staff.
these
the
aren't
general staff.
correctional officers, right? These are
Well,
kitchen supervisors.
they are, and they can deputize as COs. And like,
Okay.
like there was an emergency, they're allowed to go into the units and run stuff. They have every authority. They have the same badge, the same training, but they're
Yeah.
just, their job duties are different. So I
Okay.
did see very ethical behavior from them, and they weren't out to get each other. It was just, they knew, they were so experienced. One of them had almost 30 years, working in Connecticut prisons, and then others had, at least 20. So they were really experienced, and they knew if they let it go out of control, that there was going to no end. And yourself, like when people are like turning their blind eye towards either a CO that's behaving badly or an inmate that's behaving badly, it never goes to a good place. It never just resolves itself and works out. It's always headed towards some kind of problem.
Yeah.
Even if it's just that person either ends up in the hole, or the CO gets in trouble or gets removed. Sometimes they get fired. Like when you see those rule deviations and the violations, unless somebody steps in, this is headed to a bad place where somebody's going to lose something. And it may not even be a just loss, right? Like it may be that somebody innocent gets caught in this and ends up, being punished for it. But there's never a just where this is just going to go poof and end, right? It's going to continue to the point that somebody gets hurt. So in terms of that, but the COs, I think that there's there's an institutional culture in prisons, but I also think that there are unusual, demands put on COs, which is, just like there's this anti-snitch culture in a prison, there's the anti-snitch culture for the COs, right? So like if somebody were to say to, so-and-so is doing X, Y, and Z and complain about him, and he complains to a captain who might be, I don't know, like dating the CO's sister. I found that a lot of things were pretty incestuous in there. Like all the COs, a lot of them were related. They were cousins, they were brothers, they were wives and husbands. So if you go, say you're new and you go against the wrong one, you can really get screwed in terms of overtime, in terms of people like protecting you, that kind of thing. I mean, my prison was not particularly violent, so I don't think that there was ever a situation where if they left someone locked in a room with a bunch of women, I think there were enough moral women who wouldn't have let like the CO get killed, or like it's not like Oz, that TV show that used to be on HBO. It's not like that. But I do think that there's a culture that they have to contend with as well. And I think that there is, what makes it worse is that there is no accountability, or virtually no accountability, because of unions and the way that they've structured the contracts, so that basically if you work as a corrections officer, it's almost impossible to fire you.
Yes.
So I think that if there were if you knew that you would turn somebody in who was doing a really bad thing, and that there would be a proportionate and just response to that misbehavior, I think you'd see more COs turn in colleagues who are doing bad things. But because there's not, right, it's useless, right? You can go say this officer is raping this inmate, right? And if you tell the wrong captain, or the captain tells somebody else and it goes to something else, you can be harassed, you can be denied overtime. There's all sorts of, and they're not going to do anything to him, even though they might even have evidence that he's doing that. Okay, so there's the incentive system, and I think this is probably true of like most of corrections, is so warped that we don't get people acting in the rational ways that we want them to, because they know that doing the right thing doesn't pay off for them the way that they should, or that way that we think it should.
That matches my experience almost to the T. The one thing though that you said, and I'm just going to ask you a little bit about it, because it goes so against everything I ever experienced in 25 years. When you talk about the 15 or so staff members in the kitchen that are doing their job according to the book, right? So COs, correctional employees, for instance, are not supposed to bring cell phones into the facilities. They're not supposed to bring any type of electronics into the facilities. They're not supposed to bring reading material into the facilities. I don't believe they're supposed to be eating the state food, because they're given money, an allowance to buy food. Right. They're not supposed to be giving street food to inmates, or allowing inmates to take extra food out of the kitchen. So while this may seem petty, I'll explain why I don't think it is in a second. But these 15, are you saying they were exempt from all those ethical breaches that I just talked about?
Yeah, in fact, I was just talking to somebody about this the other day,
Wow.
because I'm working on a project about with Alabama prisons and mostly the men who are in there, and they don't feed them right down. Like it's really bad. The Alabama DOC like willingly restricts food, the bare minimum that they are legally required to provide to these men,
Yeah.
on a pretty regular basis. It's completely different than Connecticut. I found that Connecticut knew that they had to meet this legal obligation, and they tried to do it, but in Alabama, no. And I never stole from the kitchen. I was a kitchen worker there, and you could trade, cheese and other things. If you were to steal it out of the kitchen,
Sure.
you could get other commissary or, other things. I was told from day one, I didn't want to steal it. First of all, the method of stealing that you probably already know is underwear. So I never understood this whole putting a chicken leg in your underwear
Yeah.
and walking out of a chow hall with it. Like it just,
Yeah.
the whole thing was disgusting to me. And
I
people used to
agree.
pull a piece of roast beef out of their underwear and say, do you want some? And I said,
Yeah.
I don't even think that this is like a conceivable scenario for people, that someone would pull roast beef out of their underwear and offer it to someone else
Yeah.
to eat.
I used to
It's
think it was so
commonplace.
pathetic that people did that. Like it
Yes,
just looks
yes.
so demeaning that you're doing
Right.
stuff
Yeah.
like
It's
that.
like you do dehumanize yourself. But
Yeah.
also, I was in there for larceny related crimes. So I wasn't going to steal anyways. And one of the reasons where I just, it's not right. I was told that I'm not supposed to do it. So therefore that's enough for me. But also, how could I like go into an appellate court or even a regular court and protest these, these charges and the convictions that they had on me, and have some evidence, even not even evidence, no, in I knowing that I did it myself, that I was
Yeah.
pilfering cheese out of the kitchen. And there's this kind of sense like, well, this is how we get back at them. Like the state is screwing us because they're not treating us right. So let's take a pound of American cheese and
Yeah.
we'll settle the score, which is patently absurd by itself. Like, I
It's
mean,
just a
that's
rationalization for
but
doing
I
what they
I
want to do
never
anyway.
stole. I never stole, and this was a big thing because they used to try to search the kitchen workers as we walked from the kitchen back to our cells. And I always like people used to try to avoid being searched, and I used to go up right to an officer, whoever was doing the searching, and I would be like, "Let's just go. Like, you want to strip search me? Bring me in here, pat me down, whatever you need to do." And they looked at me like I was crazy, and I'm sure they all thought I was crazy, but it was also like, I'm not doing anything. Let's just get this whole routine of you checking me done because I have nothing to hide, and let's keep going from it. And so I actually earned a reputation, probably the only positive reputation I earned in there. But it as read that I wasn't gonna screw the officers by you know, doing something behind their back and trying to take something out of the kitchen. So there was I would say a certain modicum of respect that they knew that I wasn't going to do that to them. They had asked me not to do it, and I said, yes, I won't do it. And I honored that promise. And this is a big deal, I would say, in other prison systems, because I don't think people understand these places are definitely unfair. They're poorly run. The whole paradigm of corrections in the United States. It doesn't matter which system you choose. If you choose a county jail in another state or a federal prison or one of our state prisons, it doesn't matter. It's all screwed up. But if you do stick to your principles and refuse to engage in certain behavior, there is a payoff. I'm not saying it's a huge payoff, but there is a payoff. And I think this is one of the things that disconnects for a lot of the people in prison, is that they don't know that if you just hold on long enough, by doing the right thing, not stealing, not misrepresenting, like whatever it is, you stay, kind of true to whatever the rule is, your internal rule or even an external rule that's been imposed on you, you can get to somewhere where you get a benefit. Either
Mm.
it's that people trust you more, that you're free of discipline, like you don't even have to worry about like someone coming in and trying to punish you or take your privileges or anything else. And that was the biggest lesson for me, is how many women that I was around that did not know, if they just stuck with it and stayed on it. Even I would say this is true even in addiction, right? Like if you just try to stay clean, just get through the day without using, you will eventually get to a place where there's a payoff. And I really feel like that's the lesson that's missing, when people come in, and it's not a lesson that's being imparted to them enough while they're there to help them when they get out. And the way I saw that the most was that women I worked with, and also like I saw working in other situations at York, they didn't know how to work hard. And I want to be clear, that's not me saying that they're lazy. I don't think that at all. They just did not know that if they did like something in a sustained way over a certain amount of time, that they would actually get a benefit from it. Right. Like, so if
Why
they,
are you so reluctant to say they're lazy?
because I think a lot of times when I've said this before, people have interpreted that I'm saying they're lazy. And I really don't think that they were. I think they literally were like, oh, if I go every day to work, Mr. B, who runs the laundry, who I happen to think I didn't never work for him, but I would say his name was Bernstein. And I would actually say he was an exceptional employee for DOC because he trained the women who worked in our laundry so well to work hard, to be honest, to do what they were told in terms of, like, you know, how the laundry ran. So many people say I owe my success post prison to Mr. B because of what he taught me when I worked in laundry. He taught me a work ethic. He taught me this. He taught me that. So that's why, I don't know if you've read a lot of my stuff, but I'm very actually pro prison labor. I know everyone denounces it as slavery and everything else. And I think that the low wages are a problem, but I also think that it's probably even more than education, the way towards rehabilitation and getting people to understand if they just toe the line for a little bit longer, that there can be a payoff, there can be a promotion, more money, that's something. If you just, rather than just quitting and saying, oh, this, my situation, I don't like it, it's unfair, which it very well maybe, that's it, I'm rebelling and I'm not going to honor these rules. If you hang on a little bit longer, you will get to a better place. And that's something that I feel like was absolutely missing. The women who did get it found out about it after, you know, when they they learned their lessons from Mr. Bernstein when they came home. But that's something that I thought was really never made explicit to a lot of women. And I'm more of a thinker than a lot of the women that were in there. So I think it needs to be made explicit to a number of people who are incarcerated. People like you and me who are overthinking this stuff like day and night and running it through our minds, it will catch it. But people who are not used to thinking that that heavily about things, or are not used to pondering these things, might not catch that lesson.
Okay, so you said so much that's good, and you also said some stuff I'm going to disagree with. But before I get to it, I just want to go back a little bit to when I said about staff members bringing in cell phones or giving food to inmates, or I didn't mention it, I don't think, but, you know, undue familiarity with inmates. The reason it's important that they don't even break small rules is because inmates are watching. And if inmates see that the staff don't follow the rules, the inmates themselves gain a view of the world whereby everybody's a rule breaker. Everybody's a crook. Everybody's just like me. It's just they get away with it. And that's never a message that you want to send.
There's that, or there's also even a refinement of a lesson, which is that you can, if you can figure out a way to get away with it, then rule breaking is fine. It's really not rule breaking, it's normal behavior.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, you said that if you just stick with your principles, you will get the payoff. You also said earlier about the incentive system in prison. See, this is where it's a nuanced disagreement that I have with you, because I do think that in life in general, there's a tendency when you stick to your principles, eventually you get a payoff. Eventually things get better for you. But in prison on a day-to-day basis, for instance, you gave the example of you're not stealing the cheese, right?
Right.
Now, they feed you terribly in prison, right? And I don't mean terribly as far as the food not tasting good. I'm talking about terribly in terms of portions and in terms of nutrients.
Yeah.
It's actually counterproductive for society, because they're going to end up spending more money on the back end in terms of paying medical bills than they would have if they just fed it appropriately. So you every day are doing this. You're not stealing, you're sticking to your guns. Meanwhile, I know women are stealing every day. And there's very rarely a consequence to that. Even if the officer in the block sees somebody in the prisons I've been in, if you can make it out of the kitchen back to the block, it's like a dead issue. Nobody cares anymore. So the COs see you bringing in the bagged up chicken that's been in your underpants, or the milks or cheese or whatever, and no one cares. No one says anything about it. So in that instance, the person who's doing what's right ends up going hungry, whereas the people who are doing wrong are eating in plenty. And there's so many examples like that in prison. And an example I always give, because to me it's just so typical and encapsulates almost the entire prison experience when it comes to this issue. I used to work in the prison industries as well. Now, we had a block full of 96 guys, and I think 40 of us worked in the industries. And there's limited showers, and the rec was split tier. So when we would get back from work, there would be a shower list where if your rec isn't out, if your tier is not out for rec, you sign up for the shower and lock up, and then you get in the shower when your term comes. The thing was, my cellie and I were the only two that obeyed that rule. No one else did, but there was no consequence to it because the COs are too busy, talking or playing video games or whatever. So they're not paying any attention. They really don't care. So everybody gets a shower. Everyone gets extra rec, except for the two guys that actually obeyed the rule end up punished. And that happens every single day in prison, especially when you're doing the right thing. And it not only puts you at odds in terms of not getting the rewards of rule breaking, but then the other inmates are also upset with you, as I'm sure you've dealt with working in the kitchen where other girls wanted you to bring stuff back for them and you refuse, and now they're upset with you. That happens all the time, and it's just such a disincentive. So to tell somebody in those conditions, don't worry, in the long run it's going to pay off, when their everyday experience is that it's not going to, it's a very, very tough argument to make.
It is a tough argument to make, but I think it's about length of time, right? So if someone was in for like 6 months, they probably aren't going to get this lesson. But I was around people who were doing more time than I was. So I was, and I was in there for 6 years. That was not a short period of time.
No.
So I think over time, people knew, like, I think they would never say anything to me. I'm sure they talked about me behind my back, but they would never say Chandra's like, whatever for not taking the cheese home for us. But I also think that they knew over time that if I really was in a jam, right? Because I actually did get in a lot of jams. There happened to be a one CO who was unusually dedicated to like torturing me. And I needed protection from him a number of times. Is that they saw that if I were in a jam, that they looking on, they would have said, she's done. She's going to go to solitary and, seg, and it's over for her for now. That they saw these guys intervene in an ethical way, right? They weren't doing me any favors. They were just saying, we know this employee, she works for us. We know she didn't do this, or we witnessed that she didn't do X, Y, or Z or something like that. And I think that they saw what it's like to have what it's like when you earn a respect. And I don't mean respect like, oh, they think you're great. I'm talking about that they know your character and they know what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. And you've become reliable and consistent to someone else. That's another thing that I think is big, is that like consistency is not emphasized in a place where, right, everything is pretty rote and automatic and consistent in terms of like, days don't really vary one from the other, right? It's always the same amount of time unless there's an emergency or something else. So consistency is not emphasized. So I think, and I may be giving myself entirely too much credit, but I think that over time, like I worked for 5 years in the food service, and with not stealing anything once, that they knew that this is a person who has earned something in there in terms of respect from other people. And there's also the benefit she has is that a clear conscience. I never had to worry about someone going into my room, my cell, and tossing it and finding the ketchup that I stole, or that like it's something freeing about not having to worry about how to make these moves that weren't allowed. All right. And so I think that might have been a more silent and a slower lesson, but I think it did get through to the people who are around me for years upon years. Right.
Yes.
So and a lot of people don't spend that much time in prison, especially at York. They get a 3-year sentence and they do a total of 18 months, but a lot of that's on parole. So maybe they do 9 months. So they're not really there long enough to get like that sustained lesson.
Yeah.
So but I see what you're saying. Like when rule breaking is rewarded, then it does give that perverse lesson. But I also know, because there was one particular woman who I know was giving sexual favors to staff, a number of them, and she got away with murder, right? Like she was tampering with phones once. That's a huge, that's a class A ticket. You are like, there is no negotiating with that. And she didn't have to go to solitary. She didn't have to do anything. Never got loss of commissary when she did get caught doing something. So she, basically she lived a pretty consequence-free life. She was allowed out during count time. Like it was kind of like, how is anyone not noticing this? And I actually really liked her. I thought she was a good person. I don't think that she was a mean person. She was just used to getting by breaking the rules, and also doing something unethical for an unethical person and getting them on, like, joining forces with them. So she got out shortly after I did, and she connected with me, and I noticed immediately that she was back to using drugs. She was getting arrested all the time. So I always thought this is a perfect example of what this woman, like, she didn't really follow any rules. She wasn't wild. Like, she was just doing what she wanted to get, what she wanted for herself, like tweezers, to do her eyebrows, which we couldn't have, or like occasionally she'd get a pizza, or she'd get drink mix like Crystal Light that they only had like sugar drinks, as you had the same commissary I did.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Minor things that she would get, these conveniences that she would get for her life, really made her life kind of inconvenient when she got out, because she didn't understand that this wasn't going to work on the outside. If she had heroin, they're going to arrest her for it, and she's going to go back to jail for it. So I've always thought she was a perfect example of, like, allowing people to get away with stuff does them no favors whatsoever when they get out. Right. And I know a lot, when I've discussed this with people, they say, no, it's an addiction. She's just ill because she has an addiction. That's true. But there's also, one of the ways to battle addiction is to understand you're not going to get away with it. You're either going to get caught or dead, especially with fentanyl out there now. Like, there's no good end. You're not just going to be some drug user forever, getting high. Like, there's going to be an end to this that you're not going to like, to this pattern of behavior. And she didn't learn that. And, I haven't been in touch with her for a while. I hope she's still alive, but I think that it's entirely possible, because she went right back to the drug use, because she didn't really learn anything while she did. And she did like 8 or 9 years. Like, this wasn't a skid bid at all. Is that she, they did nothing for her. Connecticut DOC did nothing to help that woman.
And the thing is that they are obligated to rehabilitate offenders by their very existence in being called corrections. So whether people think that inmates should just be punished or not is irrelevant. You're being taxed to pay for rehabilitation that inmates aren't getting. So, Chandra, earlier you were very hesitant to say that the inmates were lazy. So I'm not hesitant.
There are some that are. I want to be clear, but I wasn't painting them with a broad brush. Like, all these women in prison are lazy. There were some who literally were like, "Oh, I can work. I know how to do this. I can handle this." Yeah.
Okay. So let me paint with a broad brush. It's one of the characteristics of criminals in general that they're both physically and psychologically lazy when it comes to things they don't want to do. Inmates can be very resourceful and very energetic when it comes to getting what they want.
Yes.
But
I used to say that they're like MacGyver when they want something. They could create, they would solder stuff together. They would do anything. Yeah.
Sure. Now, you talked about the, and I want to just say at the outset, I think work in prison is very important. Teaching a good work ethic is vital. I think they're all very important. But would it surprise you to know that neither education, standard education, college, GED, that sort of stuff, nor work experience in prison are highly correlated to not going back? That they have not been shown to significantly reduce recidivism.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. I know they reduce it a little bit, but I also know, like, those studies are inherently flawed, because they're talking to people who post prison who are available for these interviews. So you're naturally going to pull people who are in more stable situations. Like, they're not going to the homeless guy on the street and finding out if he was in prison and what happened to him. So you're going to, like, either a workplace or a university or some program, and you're asking the already successful people, what worked for you. So it actually should be higher, just because of that self-selection bias in it.
Yes.
It should be higher than it is. So yes, I would, if what real statistical significance is. So it wouldn't surprise me that they're not, but they do something. I've witnessed it.
Yes. No, I'm not saying there's no effect, but the cognitive behavioral therapy addressing criminogenic needs is by far the best reducer of recidivism when done correctly in an environment that's conducive to rehabilitation, which the current system is not. Before I let you go, I've got to ask you about this, because everything you've said, I by and large, I love it. I think it's great. But I read something that you wrote yesterday, and it was like, wow, especially given what you said earlier about the unions protecting the correctional officers. You wrote, and I don't know how long ago it was written, but you wrote that the unions are essential for prison reform. Do you still believe that? And if so, why?
Yeah, I do think they're essential, but that doesn't mean that they're going to do it, right? Like, so if the unions got on board and did this, we'd be done in like 18
Oh,
months.
sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. I misunderstood. So what you're saying is that unless they're on board, it can't get done, but you're not arguing that they would be on board.
No, I was hoping that they would when I first got out, right? Like I was, because I used to talk to a couple of the COs and stuff, and they aren't in agreement with all the ways that DOC is. Like I don't think there's any DOC employee that agrees with how DOC runs itself, which is kind
No.
of funny when you think about the because the people are our DOC, right? Like they are
Yes.
the actual problem. But no, I think if the unions got on board and said, look, we don't benefit from mass incarceration, we don't benefit from this, we don't benefit from that because we are citizens too. You could get this done in a minute. I think that things have actually gotten worse since I got out. Right, remember, I got out in 2014, and then a year later, Trump comes down the escalator, and things actually go pretty haywire, right? Like if you look at the general discussion of either prison reform or like criminal justice reform, any of that kind of stuff, things get one off track. There are certain things that have succeeded, like the barriers to employment. Things have gotten better definitely since I came home, but I also think that with the increased scrutiny of police violence, of correctional officer violence and what they do and that kind of thing. I think that these unions have become more entrenched in protecting their people and also getting money, right? Like, I don't know if you know anything about California and their guard union, but they gave a huge amount to Gavin Newsom's campaign. He's the governor now, and he basically does whatever they want, like whatever they want in their contract they get, which is basically zero accountability. So I think we're getting farther and farther away from that. But if we had them on board, this would be done in a second.
What do you think about consequence-based payment? What I mean is there's a corporation, and I don't know a whole lot about them, but what I do know is that it's called Serco. They're a private prison corporation that runs out of the UK. They have prisons in Australia, UK, and New Zealand. And they pay staff based on results. So in other words, if recidivism rates go down, the people that work in the prisons get bonuses. To me, that would be a wonderful way to run prisons where the staff was actually invested in outcomes rather than being invested in inmates staying into prison.
Yeah. In fact, there's a professor at Fordham University, John Pfaff. It's Pfaff, who wrote a book about this.
How do you
And
spell that?
Pfaff, John Pfaff. He's at Fordham.
Okay.
And he wrote a book about it, about like how it's just basically why policing and corrections are so terrible and don't get better, is that these perverse incentives are entrenched within, right? So there's certain people who just have too much of an interest in keeping us screwed up, right? Like
Yeah.
keeping these dysfunctional systems going. So he's talked about this a lot. I've never heard of that company. I think that's really interesting. Would that work? I bet. Yeah. I mean, I like, if there was some way for them to make more money by, either not having sex with an inmate, and I'm talking, women's prison. So probably didn't happen. I would hope too much in where you were. But like, if there was some other payoff to avoiding that behavior and how they interact with the correctional population, I think that would work probably pretty well. Are there any studies on like how are there recidivism rates low in these facilities?
I've only been out for 5 months, so I haven't had a chance really to. I mean, I've been very busy to delve into it, but I believe so. I mean, there's criticisms of them, but there's going to be criticisms, no matter what. But I believe that they are having beneficial effects. Like I said, I haven't delved deep into it, and I also don't know that they're necessarily administering the principle in an effective way. I just know that the corporation exists and that's what they do. And I read about them in a book called Incarceration Nations, where the woman Baz Dreisinger went all over, all over the world and studied the prison system. And she is opposed to prisons, period. And she actually was somewhat complimentary. And I also read an article in the New York Times. I can't remember who wrote it, where the guy was very much opposed to private prisons, but he actually was complimentary about the company Serco. Okay, Chandra, before I let you go, and I hope you'll come back because you've been wonderful, but is there anything I forgot to ask you? Anything you want to say?
There is so much that I would want to say, especially after 6 years in prison and 9 years home. Just that, one, keep doing what you're doing because these are the right questions. And I wrote about something, before, like about inmate relationships. And I said that there's a plaintive, plaintive undertow in inmate populations, that they're kind of complaining and identifying as victims all the time.
Yes.
And I think that this podcast and what you're talking about is actually an essential antidote to that, because it's not victim centered. Like we both know that it's BS what's happening in these places, and there's a lot of unfairness, and people get abused and treated treated terribly, right? But it's really important not to develop a victim mentality, because that's when they win, right? Like when people who are incarcerated say, I'm a victim of this, even though they are, like, straight up. I don't think that you went through a period of incarceration without being victimized. When you identify mentally that way, the game is over. Like, we will not change this stuff. We will not get better conversations about it. It will just be this entrenched bunker mentality where the COs are saying that they're great, they're honorable, they do everything right, when they clearly don't, right? And no one does. Like, so let's not even pretend. Like, it's not even an attack on COs. No one executes perfectly. Is that, we're not going to get anywhere. It's victim and aggressor, and that's and actually each side thinks that they're the victim and the other side is the aggressor, and we end up stalled in our conversations and our ideas and our innovation of how to change things.
All right, Chandra, where can people find you?
They can go to www.prison-diaries.com. That's the old blog, but there is a contact page if they need to get in touch with me, or they can just find my writing at the National Memo, which is nationalmemo.com, or witnessla.com, or even connecticutexaminer.com. It's ctexaminer.com. And also, if they Google me, I'm on Twitter, Facebook, all these other places. So if anyone needs to reach out, I'm findable for sure.
All right, great. And I do hope you will come back.
I definitely will. You keep me in mind when you need a guest, and I'm happy to come back.
Absolutely. Well, for now, I'm Michael Liebowitz. This is the Rational Egoist signing off. Remember, like, share, comment, subscribe. Until next time.